The trouble in Cedar Ridge started long before anyone realized just how tangled the drama would become. The neighborhood was supposed to be peaceful, manicured lawns, a well-funded HOA, and houses arranged so neatly it felt more like a showroom than a community. But underneath the polished exteriors lived an ecosystem of whispers, grudges, and one woman who seemed to feed off conflict like it was oxygen. Her name was Marjorie Crowden, though most residents simply called her the HOA Karen. She approached rule enforcement with the zeal of someone guarding a royal palace. Over time, her interest in keeping the neighborhood in order had spilled far beyond what anyone would consider reasonable. She documented trash, cans left out for more than 6 minutes, measured grass height with a litter ruler, and kept a running spreadsheet of every violation she personally observed, real or imagined. The HOA board tolerated her because she was loud enough to be useful, and no one wanted to be the one to challenge her directly. But everything truly ignited the day my wife moved in. My wife, Layla, was the complete opposite of the energy that Marjorie radiated. Calm, composed, structured, and frighteningly unbothered by chaos. We decided to move back to Cedar Ridge after years in the city, so we could live closer to her courtroom jurisdiction. I worked remotely, and she served as a newly appointed municipal judge, known in the legal circuit for her fairness and her unshakable ability to remain impartial even under pressure. We kept her job quiet, not because it was a secret, but because Cedar Ridge already had a reputation for neighbors weaponizing information. The morning she arrived, there were no fireworks, no confrontations, no disruptions, at least not yet. She simply moved her suitcases inside and examined the small front yard, already imagining where she wanted the rose bushes to go. But the tranquility evaporated the moment Marjorie noticed her. To Marjorie, every unfamiliar face was a threat to her dominion over the HOA rules. She watched from her window, binoculars practically glued to her face as Layla unloaded a few boxes from the car. Later that afternoon, she strutted over like a general inspecting enemy territory. She circled the driveway, scanned the porch, and scribbled something aggressively into her small laminated violation pad. I wasn't even outside to hear what she said, but I knew that posture all too well. Someone was about to receive a printed notice on their door, and she was the one delivering it. At first, Layla brushed it off. She said the neighborhood likely had a particular passionate volunteer. But I knew Marjorie wasn't just passionate, she was territorial. And when she felt her power slipping, she pushed harder. The first complaint she filed against us was ridiculous, unauthorized residential cohabitation, a made-up accusation claiming Layla had moved in without HOA approval. The second came the next day, suspicious activity at Residence 17B. By the end of the week, she had filed 3 separate reports with the HOA and 1 report with the local police, claiming a potential trespasser had taken up residence in our home. When the patrol car rolled down our street, lights off, but presence unmistakable. Neighbors peeked through blinds with a hunger for gossip. Officers approached politely, already looking tired. They stated that someone had reported an unlawful occupant. Layla calmly provided her ID and documentation, and the matter ended as quickly as it started, but the humiliation and suspicion Marjorie tried to create lingered. She wasn't done. Word around Cedar Ridge spread fast. Marjorie spent the next 3 days parading around the neighborhood telling anyone who would listen that she had prevented some questionable woman from squatting in our home. She claimed she had forced the police to take action when others were too scared to say anything. Even worse, she insisted she was watching the situation closely as though we were criminals temporarily at bay. But the irony, the stunning, poetic irony, was that while she eagerly tried to drag Layla's name through the mud, she had no idea who she was provoking. The universe, or fate, or whatever force enjoys weaving poetic justice into everyday life, had just begun spinning its threads. Because as the following week unfolded, a new scandal erupted in Cedar Ridge, one involving misappropriated HOA funds, falsified maintenance reports, and allegations of abuse of authority. And while the neighborhood buzzed with speculation and panic, the case was officially forwarded to the municipal courthouse for oversight. A courthouse where a rotating docket schedule had just assigned a new judge. A judge named Layla Farron. But Marjorie didn't know any of this yet. She was too busy preparing her next move, convinced she needed to save the community from the woman she had already convinced herself was some unlawful intruder. In her mind, she had become a guardian, a protector, the last line of defense in a neighborhood crumbling under threats only she could see. Layla, meanwhile, stayed patient, impossibly patient, observing the circus unfold without reacting emotionally. She treated Marjorie like one would treat a barking dog behind a fence, loud but ultimately harmless. What she didn't anticipate was how far Marjorie was willing to go. Because on the 4th night after Layla moved in, A new complaint was filed not just against her, but against me too. This one wasn't a simple HOA notice. It wasn't a police wellness check. It was a formal civic complaint, claiming we had violated multiple HOA bylaws, trespassing, unauthorized residency, harassment, and creating a hostile environment for long-term residents. It was signed, stamped, and delivered directly to the municipal clerk. A clerk who immediately recognized the address. A clerk who placed the complaint into the system. A system that automatically routed the case toward the next available judge. A judge who would be presiding the following Tuesday. A judge whose name was printed in bold letters at the top of the assigned docket. Judge Layla Farron. The woman Marjorie had spent 2 weeks harassing, the same woman she called the cops on, was now the person who would be sitting at the bench, listening to the charges she herself had filed. And still, Marjorie had no idea. As the weekend approached and the tension in Cedar Ridge thickened, I watched Layla prepare for the upcoming docket with her usual discipline. She read every case thoroughly. She reviewed each document without emotional bias. And when she reached our case, the one involving Marjorie's accusations, her expression didn't change. She simply placed the file into its proper position as though it were any other. But I knew better. A storm was coming. A reckoning was forming quietly behind courtroom doors, and Marjorie Crowden had no clue that the same woman she was trying to have removed from the neighborhood would soon be the one presiding over her own case, with every lie, every exaggeration, and every fabricated violation laid bare before the law. The real drama of Cedar Ridge was only beginning. The morning after the complaint was filed, Cedar Ridge woke to a new level of tension. The neighborhood looked the same on the surface, lawns trimmed, sprinklers humming, sun rising over rows of perfect townhomes, but beneath that suburban calm was a current of anticipation. Marjorie had been bragging for 2 straight days about finally taking action and protecting the neighborhood from infiltrators. It was the kind of chest-puffing performance she thrived on, and she made sure everyone saw it. She strutted around with a clipboard tucked under her arm, a walkie-talkie clip to her waistband, even though nobody else in the HOA had a matching device. She treated her self-assigned patrols as if she were conducting military surveillance, pausing every few steps to peer suspiciously at random houses, including ours. Every time she passed, she made a show of scratching something on a notepad, wanting to remind us that she believed she was in control. But Layla remained unfazed. She spent that morning reviewing the court docket while sipping coffee at the breakfast bar, her focus steady and resting entirely on the legal work in front of her. It still amazed me how effortlessly she could separate personal frustration from professional responsibility. Nothing rattled her, not even a neighbor attempting to weaponize law enforcement or a vindictive woman launching a bogus complaint. Yet outside, the neighborhood was quietly preparing for a showdown. The gossip network in Cedar Ridge operated faster than any news outlet. By midday, half the community knew that Marjorie had filed some kind of legal action, though no one seemed sure what the complaint actually contained. Some said it was about property lines, others claimed it was related to residency rights. A few whispered that perhaps it had to do with zoning regulations or unregistered occupancy permits. Only Marjorie knew the truth, that she had compiled a dramatic, nonsensical list of violations that would crumble the moment anyone with legal literacy examined it. And Layla, unfortunately for her, was the person legally obligated to do exactly that. The clock ticked closer to Tuesday's hearing as Marjorie's delusions escalated. She began organizing a small cluster of residents she had convinced were in danger, telling them they needed to stand as witnesses if things escalated. These residents weren't malicious, just easily influenced and eager to stay in her good graces. Marjorie had a way of making people feel she was their protector even when the thing she claimed to protect them from didn't exist. One of these neighbors, a retired man named Gregory, paced around his yard with anxious energy. He'd apparently been told that Layla was a suspicious unknown tenant with no verified documentation, a complete distortion of reality. Another neighbor, a timid woman who rarely spoke, seemed frightened by the narrative Marjorie had spun and avoided eye contact with us entirely. It was almost comedic, watching an unhinged myth spread through a neighborhood that prided itself on civility. But the humor wouldn't last long. The real fuse ignited when Marjorie received a notification from the courthouse confirming the hearing date and time. She misinterpreted the routine hearing notice as proof the system was taking her concern seriously and immediately printed multiple copies to wave around the cul-de-sac. She operated with an inflated sense of triumph, telling residents she had forced the city itself into action. Her delusion was complete. She believed she was leading Cedar Ridge into a righteous battle. Meanwhile, Layla spent that same evening in her home office, reviewing the stack of cases assigned her docket, giving each one the same measured attention. When she reached the complaint filed by Marjorie, She handled it with the same professionalism she extended to every case. She read the allegations carefully, examined the cited bylaws, and noted every procedural flaw. What Marjorie had filed wasn't just flimsy, it was riddled with contradictions, falsehoods, and legal inaccuracies so glaring that even a junior clerk would have flagged them. Still, Layla didn't react emotionally. She placed the case file into her docket folder, organized her paperwork, and closed her laptop with the same calm she always carried. She said nothing, but the air around her felt like a storm gathering strength in silence. The next day, Marjorie escalated again. She marched to the HOA board meeting with charts, photographs taken from odd angles, and printouts of the bogus violations she had fabricated. She demanded that the board support her case. She claimed Layla was a rogue occupant, and insisted she herself was being harassed simply for doing her civic duty. The board members, exhausted by her theatrics, did their best to remain diplomatic, but even they were straining under the absurdity. Some tried to point out that everything she claimed had already been disproven when the police visited. Others reminded her that legal residency was not a HOA-controlled matter, but she had convinced herself of a threat that did not exist, and nothing could force her to see reason. By late afternoon, she was pacing our street again, muttering to herself about dangerous people hiding behind normal appearances. What she didn't know, what she absolutely could not have imagined, was that the next 24 hours would flip everything upside down. Because late that evening, the courthouse posted the publicly accessible docket schedule, listing all cases, times, and presiding judges for the week. A docket that included her complaint. A docket that listed Judge Layla Farron as the presiding authority. The same woman she had been stalking, the same woman she called the police on, the same woman she had harassed endlessly. But Marjorie, in her obsessive frenzy, didn't check the schedule, others did. By sunrise the next morning, whispers began circulating. Residents exchanged glances, then hushed conversation. Shock moved through the community like an electric current. Some people quietly reached out to warn her. Others simply watched the unraveling with morbid fascination. It was only when one of her own supporters mentioned the judge's name that the realization hit Marjorie like a blow. According to witnesses, she froze mid-sentence. Her posture collapsed into stiff stillness. Her face drained of color. Then came the panic. She stormed back to her home, slamming the door so hard it echoed across several houses. Curtains snapped shut, lights flicked on and off, and for the first time since the entire ordeal began, the self-appointed Queen of Cedar Ridge fell completely silent. That night, Layla and I sat quietly at home as the neighborhood held its collective breath, waiting to see what would unfold in the morning. Marjorie had spent weeks trying to weaponize authority she did not have. Now she was about to stand in front of someone who actually held it, and that someone was the very woman she tried to force out of the neighborhood. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the courtroom doors were about to open. Tuesday morning approached with the kind of anticipation normally reserved for storms or scandals. Cedar Ridge woke unusually early, lines lifting one by one as neighbors peeked out to see whether Marjorie would actually show up for the hearing she herself had demanded. The quiet hum of the neighborhood had been replaced with sharp, buzzing tension. Even the air felt taut, as if the entire subdivision knew it was about to witness something historic. Marjorie's house remained dark for longer than usual. She was not outside with her clipboard. She was not measuring grass heights. She did not appear on her porch to glare at passing joggers. For the first time in years, the self-appointed enforcer of Cedar Ridge had seemingly retreated into hiding. But retreat was not surrender, it was panic. A panic that had brewed overnight inside her house like a pressure cooker left unchecked. Meanwhile, Layla prepared for the day with the same methodical calm she carried into every hearing. She ironed her judge's blouse, polished the small silver earrings she always wore, and tied her hair neatly. Nothing in her demeanor reflected the chaos unfolding outside our home. Her discipline was not for show, it was a part of her identity. She believed in the structure of the law, the neutrality of justice, and the stability that came from doing things properly. She reviewed her docket one final time at the breakfast bar. Each folder neatly stacked, including Marjorie's complaint. She made no comment about it. To her, it was simply one case among many, to be evaluated on facts alone. But I could see the underlying tension, the knowledge that she would have to sit on that bench, listen to the woman who had harassed her relentlessly, and uphold the integrity of her role, even if the situation bordered on the absurd. When she left for the courthouse, the neighborhood watched her drive away like silent spectators at the beginning of a performance. Some were rooting for her. Some were simply curious, and a few, those loyal to Marjorie, exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the woman they'd backed might have led them into a disaster. By the time I arrived at the courthouse to observe, as any member of the public had the right to do, there was a noticeable cluster of Cedar Ridge residents already gathered outside. Some kept their distance, not wanting to appear too invested. Others whispered, trading theories about how the hearing would unfold. They weren't there for support, they were there because suburban curiosity, fueled by HOA drama, had an irresistible pull. Inside, the waiting area felt equally charged. People shifted in their seats, glancing toward the hallway that led to the courtroom. It wasn't long before Marjorie arrived, and her entrance sent a ripple through the room. She looked nothing like the confident, rule-wielding powerhouse she portrayed in the neighborhood. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup hastily applied, and she carried a folder that bulged with papers, likely the same fabricated evidence she had built her complaint upon. Her eyes darted nervously to every corner, scanning faces for support. Her so-called witnesses avoided her gaze. They had no intention of sinking with her now that they understood the scale of her mistake. She sat stiffly, clutching her folder so tightly her knuckles whitened. When the bailiff finally opened the doors to Courtroom 2B, the room filled quickly. I found a seat near the back, watching as neighbors settled in, the buzz of whispers rising and falling like waves. Then, the side door opened. The courtroom rose collectively to its feet as Judge Layla Farron stepped in, her robe flowing behind her with quiet authority. Marjorie's reaction was instantaneous. Her jaw slackened, her shoulders stiffened, and the color drained from her face once again. She had known this was coming, but witnessing it in person was a different kind of blow. Layla sat with the same calm dignity she always carried. She organized her notes, scanned the room, and began the session. Her voice was steady, neutral, and entirely free of emotion. To the public, she looked like any judge starting another Tuesday docket. Only I could see the trace of controlled tension behind her eyes. The docket moved through several routine cases first. Minor disputes, fines, permits, procedural motions. Each case was handled with precision. Layla's professionalism was unmistakable. She was composed, decisive, and fair. Even the residents, who had never seen her in a courtroom, were impressed, whispering quietly about her poise. Then the bailiff announced the next case. Cedar Ridge HOA versus residents of 17 Billions. A hush fell over the room. Marjorie stood on shaky legs, clutching her folder like a lifeline. She stepped forward hesitantly, too stunned to speak. The absurdity of the situation had finally settled on her like a heavy weight. She had filed a legal complaint against the very person now tasked with ruling on it. The irony was brutal, almost theatrical. Layla remained composed. She did not look at me. She did not look at Marjorie with familiarity. She looked at her the same way she looked at any other complainant, calm, impartial, and entirely professional. She began reviewing the complaint aloud, listing the allegations Marjorie had submitted. As she read them, the holes in Marjorie's story became glaringly obvious to everyone present. Claims of unauthorized residency contradicted documented property records. Accusations of trespassing were invalid because Layla was legally co-owner of the home. Assertions about suspicious behavior had no basis in law and were rooted entirely in personal perception. Each flaw in the complaint echoed through the courtroom, and each one made Marjorie shrink a little more. She swayed slightly where she stood, as if the weight of her own delusion was pressing down on her shoulders. When Layla reached the segment describing Marjorie's police report, the courtroom shifted. People glanced at one another, recognizing that humiliation was coming not through revenge but through facts. The police report specifically noted that no violation had occurred. That alone should have ended everything. But Marjorie had pushed further. She had escalated the situation, weaponized legal systems, and dragged it into a courtroom. Now she was facing the consequences of her own fixation. Layla proceeded to outline the legal standard for filing complaints, the requirement for factual evidence, and the implications of abusing civic procedures for personal grievances. Her tone never changed, not even slightly. She remained controlled, authoritative, and entirely unreactive to the personal nature of the case. By the time she finished reading the final page of Marjorie's complaint, the entire courtroom understood what was happening. This wasn't a legal argument. This wasn't a dispute. This was a neighbor committing harassment under the guise of HOA enforcement. Marjorie's breathing was shallow. She clutched her folder tighter. Her eyes flicked from Layla to the residents seated behind her, many of whom were now staring at her with disbelief. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Layla prepared to address the validity of the complaint. And in that suspended moment, it felt as though Cedar Ridge itself was holding its breath. The woman who had terrorized the neighborhood with clipboards and walkie-talkies was seconds away from being confronted not by an opponent, but by the very justice system she tried to manipulate. And there was no escaping the truth now. The silence in Courtroom 2B was so dense, It almost felt alive, pulsing with tension. Every person seated behind Marjorie leaned slightly forward, drawn into the unraveling of her case the way spectators lean toward the edge of their seats during an unfolding disaster. Even those who had come merely out of curiosity were now fully invested. Cedar Ridge had always been known for its gossip, but no one had ever imagined they'd be witnessing a live implosion of Marjorie Crowden's authority. Judge Layla Farron turned another page of the complaint file, her expression unchanged. She read with the same measured attentiveness she had applied to every case before. This one, no emotion, no indication of personal involvement, only judicial clarity. That discipline was something the courtroom respected immediately. It wasn't vengeful justice unfolding. It was structured, principled, and quietly powerful. As she reviewed the final allegation, noting its lack of evidence, Layla closed the folder gently. The sound echoed through the room, small but definitive. It was a sound that signaled the beginning of the end for Marjorie. The courtroom watched as Layla lifted her eyes, not harshly, not triumphantly, but with the composed calm of someone who had spent years mastering the art of neutrality. She outlined the legal criteria for valid complaints, detailing how each of Marjorie's claims fell dangerously short. She spoke of procedural misuse, a potential misrepresentation of facts, and the seriousness of filing false statements in both HOA and municipal contexts. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The clarity alone was devastating. From the back row, I watched Marjorie unravel. Her breathing grew heavier, her cheeks flushed, sweat forming along her hairline. She seemed to shrink as Layla walked through each point of failure in the complaint one by one, layer by layer, stripping it down until it stood exposed as nothing more than a smear campaign built on paranoia and obsession. The residents who had once supported her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some stared at their shoes. Others exchanged looks that bordered on regret. They hadn't expected the situation to escalate to this level. They knew Marjorie was strict, overbearing, and intrusive, but none had imagined she would drag the entire neighborhood into a legal spectacle based on pure fantasy. And Layla, now fully in her judicial role, left no ambiguity. She stated plainly that not only were the allegations unsupported by evidence, but that several of them appeared retaliatory in nature. She referenced the documented police visit, the report confirming no violation. She noted that Layla herself was a lawful resident and co-owner of the home. She referenced HOA bylaws that Marjorie had misquoted or distorted. She even cited specific sections that showed Marjorie had violated procedure more than once. Each corrected misstatement was a quiet strike against the foundation of Marjorie's self-appointed authority. Every factual clarification tore away another piece of the persona she had used to dominate Cedar Ridge. By the time Layla finished, the courtroom felt frozen in place. What Marjorie had likely believed would be her moment of triumph had become the most humiliating reckoning she could have imagined. Then, with the same calm composure, Layla delivered her ruling. She declared the complaint legally insufficient, procedurally flawed, and unsupported by credible evidence. She dismissed it in full. But she didn't stop there, because the courtroom needed closure, and Marjorie needed to face the consequences of her conduct. With her tone still neutral, never personal, Layla addressed the seriousness of abusing legal processes for personal conflicts. She explained the strain it placed on municipal resources, the potential consequences for filing misleading statements, and the expectation that neighboring disputes be handled through proper channels rather than escalated through false accusations. She issued a formal warning, a judicial admonishment rarely given, but undeniably appropriate. Marjorie's knees wobbled, and she braced herself against the table. Her sense of authority had crumbled completely. For the first time since moving into Cedar Ridge, I witnessed her strip of the confidence she had used as a weapon against the entire neighborhood. When Layla concluded the ruling, the courtroom didn't shift into applause or murmurs. It simply held a quiet, stunned stillness. Some residents stared at Marjorie with disbelief. Others showed a flicker of sympathy. But most, if they were honest, felt a sense of relief finally seeing someone confront the woman who had terrorized the community for years. The bailiff dismissed the room, and people rose slowly from their seats. I stepped out, choosing to remain near the back, to avoid adding to the spectacle. But Marjorie remained frozen where she stood, her arms wrapped tightly around her folder of useless documents. As the courtroom emptied around her, she was left alone in a sea of suddenly distant allies. Eventually, she gathered her things and stumbled toward the exit. Her walk was unsteady, more like she was trying not to fall apart than trying to maintain dignity. When she stepped into the hallway, it was clear the neighborhood's eyes were on her. Some avoided her gaze entirely. Others stared openly, unable to hide their shock. A few whispered quietly, the same way they might whisper at a funeral. The Queen of Cedar Ridge had fallen. Outside the courthouse, I watched her move across the parking lot like someone trying to outrun their own shadow. Her car door slammed shut, and she drove off abruptly, tires screeching against asphalt. She didn't wait for anyone. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't even look back. But Layla, calm, steady, unshaken, left the courthouse much later. She exited through a side door, head held high, purpose in her stride. She never once indicated that anything unusual had happened. To her, it was just one more case handled properly, nothing more. That was the difference between her and Marjorie. One built power quietly. The other clung to it loudly until it crushed her. By the time the news traveled back to Cedar Ridge, the atmosphere had transformed. Neighbors clustered in small groups, dissecting the hearing from every angle. Some people expressed admiration for Layla. Others expressed embarrassment for ever believing Marjorie's story. And a few, the chronic gossipers, were already crafting new narratives to feed into the rumor chain. But what stood out most was the shift in tone. For the first time in years, the residents felt free from the fear of Marjorie. Her clipboards, her walkie-talkies, her threats, her obsessive monitoring. A collective weight had been lifted. And in that vacant space, something new settled in respect. Not fear. Not gossip, but genuine respect for the woman Marjorie had tried so desperately to tear down. Yet the story wasn't over, not by a long shot, because humiliation doesn't soften someone like Marjorie. It ignites them. It transforms embarrassment into anger. And the days that followed the courtroom showdown would expose just how far Marjorie was willing to fall and how far she was willing to go to claw back what she believed she'd lost. Marjorie returned to Cedar Ridge like a storm cloud, drifting over a peaceful neighborhood, darkening everything in its path. But this time, the power she once wielded had evaporated. Her authority, real or imagined, had shattered inside Courtroom 2B, and the entire community felt the aftershock. In the days following the hearing, Cedar Ridge changed in ways no one expected. It wasn't loud or chaotic, it was subtle. Quiet conversations at mailboxes, faster than usual closing blinds when Marjorie walked past, a sudden drop in the number of residents who waved to her. The shift wasn't malicious, it was a natural recalibration after years of forced obedience. For the first time, people saw her for what she was, a neighbor who weaponized rules to mask insecurity, grasping for control she never truly had. But Marjorie didn't take the loss gracefully. Her behavior spiraled quickly. On the first morning after the ruling, she resumed her patrol of the neighborhood. But instead of walking with confidence, clipboard in hand and chin raised high, she moved with frantic determination. Her posture was tense, her eyes snapping toward houses as if searching for something, anything to feel powerful again. She took photos of random driveways, measured grass heights with shaky hands, recorded videos of cars parking on the street. It was as if she believed evidence existed somewhere, hiding in plain sight, waiting to justify her vendetta. But none of it mattered anymore. Residents no longer flinched when she approached. They no longer adjusted their trash bins or lawn ornaments or holiday lights to please her. Some simply turned away, others walked inside. The spell she once cast over Cedar Ridge was broken, and it infuriated her. She began leaving printed notices on doors, unofficial HOA warnings she created herself, stamped with a fake emblem that looked like something she'd designed in 10 minutes on a computer. Most residents removed them without reading, tearing them up before tossing them into the trash. A few returned them to her mailbox. One was taped to her door with a sticky note that read this: "Eyes not real." The humiliation took root, growing into a quiet rage that simmered behind her windows. But the real unraveling began 3 days after the hearing. It was a warm, calm evening when a group of neighbors gathered near the cul-de-sac, chatting casually about weekend plans. Someone mentioned the hearing. Someone else expressed admiration for Layla. For the first time, Layla's name was spoken with pride instead of suspicion. And then someone joked, not cruelly, but truthfully, that Marjorie had finally met her match. What none of them realized was that Marjorie was standing just inside her doorway listening. The next morning, she exploded. She marched outside before sunrise, dragging her garbage bin violently across the driveway as if punishing it for existing. She slammed doors, slammed shutters, slammed the lid on her mailbox. Residents walking their dogs slowed down, staring, unsure whether to help or keep their distance. One jogger changed direction entirely. Then she began knocking on doors, hard, loud, furious knocks that startled half the street awake. She demanded compliance, demanded respect, demanded that residents restore order to the community. People refused to open their doors. Some told her to leave through closed blinds. A few recorded her from behind curtains. By noon, her meltdown had become the talk of the entire neighborhood. Even the HOA board, which had tolerated her antics for years, finally stepped in. They issued a formal notice instructing her to cease all unauthorized enforcement activities immediately. They warned her that continued harassment could result in penalties or even legal consequences. It was the first official reprimand she'd ever received from the board she once dominated. The notice sent her into another spiral. She retreated indoors for the rest of the day, and the cul-de-sac remained eerily quiet. Lights flickered in her house long into the night. Shadows moved behind curtains. Occasionally, the faint sound of a slammed drawer floated through the still air. But her silence wasn't relief. It was the pause between storms. The following day, something unexpected happened. Marjorie filed an appeal with the HOA board, not against the ruling Layla issued because she could not challenge a court's decision, but against the treatment she claimed she had received from neighbors. In her statement, she accused the entire community of conspiring against her. She blamed collective hostility, emotional coercion, and group sabotage. The accusations were wild, baseless, and drenched in paranoia. When the board read her letter, they realized what the neighborhood had already sensed. Marjorie wasn't just angry. She was unraveling. Instead of granting her appeal, they scheduled a mandatory meeting with her. One focused on conduct, boundaries, and the proper role of HOA members. They invited her to share concerns, but they also intended to set clear limitations. But Marjorie saw it as another attack. The morning of the meeting, she left her home looking hollow, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. She moved stiffly, gripping her notes like a lifeline. Residents watched her go, not with fear, but with a strange mix of concern and curiosity. The neighborhood had transformed from her territory into a place observing her decline. The meeting lasted only 20 minutes. Witnesses later said Marjorie refused to accept any responsibility. She accused the board of betrayal, claimed the community had turned against her, and insisted that Layla's involvement in the case was fraudulent, a claim so outrageous that the board immediately shut it down. When they asked her to step back from her self-assigned enforcement role, she snapped. Her voice rose, her words lost coherence, and the board ended the meeting early. She stormed out of the HOA office, red-faced and trembling. It was no longer about rules, no longer about order, not even about power. It was about ego. A fragile ego finally cracking under the weight of reality. The following days brought a new pattern of chaos. Lights flicking on and off at odd hours. Loud arguments from inside her home, though she lived alone. Random lawn decorations moved around as if she was rearranging them compulsively. A stack of papers piled on her porch. Outdated HOA notices, printed warnings, scribbled notes. She patrolled less now, not out of restraint, but because the authority she once fabricated no longer existed. The neighborhood walked past her home without fear, without hesitation, without the deferential glance she once demanded. And that, more than anything, was what broke her. Because Marjorie wasn't addicted to rules, she was addicted to being obeyed. Her world, once controlled tightly with clipboards and demands, was crumbling. And deep inside the collapsing shell of who she used to be, desperation was building, dangerous, unpredictable, and ready to erupt in one final act the neighborhood never saw coming. Because when someone like Marjorie loses control, they don't fade quietly. They come back swinging. And what happened next would test every resident of Cedar Ridge and push Layla into a role she never anticipated. The hearing resumed after a short recess, but the energy inside the community room felt entirely different now. Karen, once haughty and composed, now sat stiffly in her chair, clutching a stack of papers so tightly the edges had curled under her nails. The board members, emboldened by Melissa's calm authority, no longer looked at Karen with the same reverence they once unconsciously gave her. Instead, they watched her with a mixture of apprehension and quiet resolve, as if awakening from a long spell. Melissa re-entered the room with the steady confidence of someone fulfilling a duty, not seeking revenge. Her posture remained controlled, her face neutral, but her eyes carried a clarity that told everyone she had already made her decision, not because she wanted to punish Karen, but because Karen's behavior had left no other responsible choice. The room quieted as Melissa took her seat at the panel. The shuffling stopped, the whispers died. Even the click of the air conditioner seemed to soften in respect of the moment. For the first time, Karen appeared unsure of herself. The neighbor who always strutted around the community like she owned each square foot now seemed painfully aware of how exposed she truly was. Melissa began the final portion of the hearing by summarizing the findings. Her voice remained steady, unaffected by nerves, bias, or personal history. She explained how the so-called violation reports submitted by Karen were inconsistent, lacked dates, and included fabricated details that did not appear in any security footage or witness statements. She cited the footage showing Karen approaching our home multiple times, lingering near windows, peering through blinds, and taking zoomed-in photos. She listed the frequency of Karen's calls to HOA security and the city police calls that document. False claims of suspicious activity and trespassing, all of which were dismissed upon arrival. Karen shifted in her seat, clearing her throat in an attempt to reclaim control of the narrative, but Melissa continued unbothered. She explained that the HOA bylaws clearly defined harassment, misuse of HOA authority, and targeted filing of frivolous complaints as serious violations. She emphasized that homeowners should feel safe in their community and that no member, regardless of tenure or personal reputation, held special privilege to weaponize the system. The board members nodded, following Melissa's reasoning. Their expressions shifted gradually from discomfort to firm agreement. One of them, an older man who had lived in the community for more than 2 decades, looked almost relieved, as though Karen's reign of intimidation had been more burdensome than anyone had ever admitted out loud. The room remained silent as Melissa reached the final section of her summary. She laid out the necessary consequences for Karen's conduct. They included formal censure, mandatory mediation training, financial penalties for misuse of HOA resources, and a 6-month suspension from all committee and enforcement roles. More importantly, she recommended that any future violations or attempts at targeted harassment would fast-track Karen into a full compliance hearing with potential for severe sanctions, including removal from all HOA leadership positions indefinitely. The board members exchanged glances, then one by one voiced their support. The decision passed unanimously. Karen's expression contorted not into the rage she was known for, but into something more fragile and bewildered. For years, she had relied on her ability to intimidate, manipulate, and overwhelm others. She had never expected the HOA to push back, let alone strip her for power. She stared forward in disbelief, blinking rapidly, as if trying to convince herself she had misheard the verdict. But there was no misunderstanding. The ruling was final. As the decision settled into the air like a long overdue correction, the neighbors in attendance released a collective breath. Some sat upright for the first time since the hearing began. Others glanced at Melissa with gratitude. It was clear that Karen's behavior had affected many more residents than she had ever admitted or realized. The hearing had become not just a case about harassment against us, but a mirror reflecting years of unchecked conduct. Melissa concluded the session by reminding everyone of the purpose of the HOA: to foster a safe, respectful community where residents could enjoy their homes without fear of retaliation or hostility. The message was firm but compassionate, capturing the essence of what the HOA should have been all along. The board adjourned, and the room slowly emptied as people filtered outside, discussing the verdict in hushed but relieved tones. Karen remained seated longer than anyone else, staring blankly at the table. She looked smaller, almost shrunken, as though the authority she had wrapped herself in for years had evaporated before her eyes. When she finally stood, it was with a stiffness that betrayed her disbelief. She grabbed her folder mechanically and headed toward the exit, her steps quick and uneven. It was clear she had no intention of making eye contact with anyone. Outside, the afternoon sun cast warm light across the sidewalks and lawns. Neighbors lingered in small clusters, speaking softly as they processed everything they had heard. When they noticed Melissa stepping out of the building, several approached her to thank her for her fairness, for her professionalism, for finally putting an end to something that had lingered far too long. Melissa responded with modest nods, reminding them that her role was simply to uphold the rules and protect the community. But the look in their eyes told her they saw it differently. They saw her as the first person willing to finally confront Karen's behavior in a meaningful way. Standing a short distance away, I watched Melissa greet each resident with kindness and patience. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of pride, not because she had won anything, but because she had stood up for what was right, without bending to the toxic dynamic Karen had cultivated. That evening, when Melissa and I returned home, the neighborhood felt noticeably lighter. The tension that had weighed on the air seemed to have lifted, replaced by a quiet but palpable sense of peace. As we stepped into our house, I reflected on how strange the journey had been. The harassment, the police calls, the fabricated violations. It had been exhausting, frustrating, unnecessarily draining. But it had led to something important: a community reclaiming its balance. In the days that followed, Karen avoided everyone. She walked her dog at odd hours, left quickly for errands, and rarely made eye contact when passing neighbors. Her influence within the HOA evaporated practically overnight, and for the first time in a long time, residents felt free to enjoy their homes without constantly looking over their shoulders. As for Melissa, she returned to her daily life with the quiet grace she always had. She didn't brag about the hearing, didn't mention Karen, didn't act victorious. She simply continued to serve the community with fairness and integrity, the same way she had built her career. And I, grateful for everything that had happened, recognized that our new chapter in this neighborhood was just beginning one shape, not by fear of a domineering neighbor, but by a renewed sense of respect, unity, and the unexpected justice delivered by the very person Karen had once tried to intimidate. It was poetic in a way, and deeply satisfying. Thanks for watching another unbelievable neighborhood saga on HOA Story Files. This community learned the hard way what happens when power gets abused, and how fast everything changes when the right person finally steps up. Justice doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrives wearing a judge's robe and a calm smile. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next wild HOA showdown, shocking Karen moment, or neighborhood twist you won't see coming. Stay tuned. More real drama from real communities is on the way. This is HOA Story Files signing off.